open access, forecasting, scheduling. At the heart of it, what it means is that these policies will mean that the various stakeholders, including discoms, pay or receive payments for the services they're providing. So they put them in a more stable footing, actually. So these have been announced by central government, but the state governments, which are essentially where the implementation really rests, these things have not happened. But beyond these, which is probably again a nearer term challenge, is the fundamental restructuring of discoms which is required. We believe that renewable capacity growth actually gives it another opportunity to reform the distribution sector. Uday scheme, which was announced, I think, sometime in 2015, was an attempt to reform the distribution sector by doing two things. The discoms' central challenges were that they had high AT&C losses, which means that they are losing money due to thefts, and they're losing money due to operational inefficiencies. The second problem was, it's a bit of a political problem, the tariff-making process was influenced by the demand from various constituencies for cheap power. So there were cross-subsidies, tariff increases were difficult. So these two things were not, Uday scheme also, unfortunately, is not able to address these two schemes. What it has been able to do only is essentially through financial engineering, that is moving debt from the discoms onto states, they have reduced some of these losses of discoms. But this is not a long-term viable strategy. We've done it before. There's a proposed Electricity Act amendment, which goes to the heart of discom structures in terms of changing governance, changing tariff making, etc. So it can, while solve some of the problems, it can also be potentially extremely disruptive, because what can happen is that the old discoms will be left with the subsidized consumers. So they'll again need support for that. So right now, these proposals are not addressing that challenge. But as I said, fundamentally, the discom business needs to be rethought given these trends which are happening anyway. So the discoms need to be more a service provider, and that trend will accelerate as renewables move forward. Last but not the least, the manufacturing. So India has not resolved this question about going for cheaper electricity versus manufacturing. To us, it's clear that we need strategic vision. A manufacturing sector, especially in the industry for the future, is vital. It will help us build high-tech capability. It will generate a lot of employment to service global demand, provides energy security, and saves foreign exchange. But we need much more than Make in India. We need a far more comprehensive policy to support the sector, which is at least 30 to 40 years of time horizon. And this goes for both solar modules as well as storage, which is an emerging sector. We need a sector which is globally competitive in terms of both cost as well as scale of operations. 10 gigawatt of auctions with 3 gigawatt of supply is not going to cut it. We will either be zero or we'll have to have big ambitions. This would mean subsidized financing, which is what some countries do. But fundamentally, we need far more investment in R&D. Both US, China, and other countries have put a lot of investment in their research institutes, in their universities to build their capabilities. The same focus which is also needed in storage and battery, which is more emerging, which is still room for India to establish itself because it's still a phase in transition. So I'll end with just 2 or 3 main points. So we are at a cusp of change. We will certainly get to renewable, 100% renewable, but we need to make sure that we do it efficiently. We need to make sure that the coal peak is done quickly, as opposed to being carried by the momentum. It also gives an opportunity to fundamentally restructure our distribution of electricity, the way it's delivered. And finally, it is an opportunity to also establish a manufacturing base. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyavat. Wonderful. Very comprehensive, very clear overview. Mr. Tripathi, if I can now invite you, you're the man in the hot seat. big plans and a huge opportunity to also do this globally, India and globally. So please.
Thank you, Sunita. Friends, it's a pleasure to be here. It's not surprising that the first report you brought in 2014. I remember it was 1st April 2014 when I joined as Secretary of Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. And before that, I was in Brussels. And so I rang up the, is the press there?
Yes.
Oh.
No, yeah.
Okay, but please, I mean, it's not for reporting. It is a little bit of personal experience that I'm telling. So I rang up the Cabinet Secretary and I told that I have some personal issues. I would like to be given a ministry where there is not much of work. So very unusual request for me because throughout career I had never made such a request. And then he said, which post do you want? In government, there is a post called Secretary Coordination. No remarks, but it's a nice post where you can really think. And in Cabinet Secretariat, Secretary Coordination is looked like a fatherly figure, where JSS are overworked. So they run to Secretary Coordination for fatherly advice. After some time, I was told that there is another place, not too heavy work. It's called Secretary MNRE. And I remembered in my 3 years in Cabinet Secretariat, I rang up the ministry once saying that we would like somebody to go to Canada urgently. Then I was told nobody was available because they were all abroad. And so there I came, and Mr. Farooq Abdullah was my minister. We had brilliant discussions. He had different vision of renewable energy. So April goes, May goes. In June, we get a call from the PMO saying that the Prime Minister would like to meet the Secretary MNRE. And our ministry was jumping because very rarely the Secretary MNRE was being called by the Prime Minister. At least that is what I was told. So I went, and the Honorable Prime Minister took out some sleep. That must be my name because he was new. And he told, we want 100,000 megawatt of solar. And I said, it's very easy, sir. We have a lot of desert in Rajasthan, some 200,000 square kilometers, 3 million hectares of wasteland. So it's very easy. But I was new to renewable energy, although I had worked in petroleum. I was chairman Pollution Control Board in Karnataka. I had worked in transport for 7-8 years, got a PMC award for my work there. But when I came back, I was feeling, did I do the right thing, 100,000 megawatt? I said, yes, it is easy. So what do? You always talk to your predecessor. And my predecessor was a very famous person, Satish Agnihotri. So I rang him up. I said, Satish, PM had called and he told like this, and I said, very easy. He said, look, in Government of India, never do or say anything without consulting your Joint Secretary. So that was good. So I came back and called my Joint Secretary, Tarun Kapoor, famous fellow. He said, yes, sir, before you came, 30 days before, we have written a letter to PMO saying that this is not possible. There is no land, there is no capital, there is no demand. Simply, it's not possible. So I said, please get me that copy. And he got me a copy. It was a 2-page letter, very well written, signed by my predecessor. So what do? I went to Mr. Piyush Goyal, young minister then, replacing some, looking after power, renewable energy, as well as coal. One person who has replaced some 7 ministers, I told, sir, I made a small mistake. I went to the PM. He told like this. I told it is very easy. But then when I came back, I find this letter is there. So truly, I should have told him that there is a letter like this. He said, so what do you plan to do? I said, I'll go back and tell him that this is not possible. He said, he's not going to listen to you. So he told me that you must go back to your ministry, call all your officers, and have a chintan. I was quite new to this word chintan, It is a sort of manthan, or a sort of, you sit down together and discuss and deliberate until you come out with a conclusion. It was getting very new word, and a lot of chintans and manthans will follow. So I called all the officers next day, I think some 50 odd of them. We had deliberations for 3 hours, and I didn't vote. because I was the chairing. So we had a voting. The question number 1 was, how many of you think 100,000 megawatt is possible? And guess, only one person raised his hand. And everybody burst into laughter because that person was going to retire shortly. So they all thought that this person was trying to be very close to the secretary by supporting what the mad thing secretary was doing. And I knew it had put a lot of pressure on the officers because 100,000 megawatt, it's very easy for the secretary to promise to the prime minister. But once you do that, it comes in the, monitoring matters that every month PMO will monitor. Well, we said how many think it's not possible, and of course, rest all raised their hands. And then we knew we were in a mess. You don't go back to the PM saying that it cannot be done. And Chintan says officers are not confident. So what we did at that point of time, CII, they had some meeting in Seoul where we met, and Soma Banerjee, who is there, I think Vice President looking after conferences, she told, why not that MNRE goes for a global summit? We never had a global summit of investors. So that is where this idea of Reinvest came. So in February 2015, we made the Reinvest. So I remember I went to the Prime Minister to brief him. So in my briefing note, in one side, I had written 100,000 megawatt. In the other page, I had written gigawatt. So he said, why do you write megawatt in one page and gigawatt in the other? Typical bureaucrat, I said, sorry, sir, it's a mistake. He said, no, it's not a mistake. Your mind is transiting from megawatt to gigawatt. And maybe that was true. We're actually transiting from megawatt, to gigawatt. But then he said, these summits are very common. You make big announcements, and nothing happens after that. So to make it more meaningful, my officers, they suggested that we come up with some written commitments. So we approached the companies, and we got a commitment for 277,000 megawatt, much more than what we actually required. And then the PMO said that, look, you get commitments, where is the money? Why don't you approach global banks, international banks, and domestic banks to give some financial commitments? No global bank gave commitments. World Bank said we don't give commitments. Not EIB or AIDB or ADB, they said we don't give commitments. If a good project comes, we finance. So it depends how good is the project. It's not in our commitments. But the domestic banks, both public and private, they came up to the occasion. They gave commitment for $77,000 million by 2022. And it was so nice with this background to read the second report, how you start from 2014. In fact, I have been in close touch with CSE. I admire this organization. Even as a student from Canada, I used to sit in the library searching into ozone chlorofluorocarbon matters in that library, taking photocopies. And coming back from that background, like thinking big and putting big. The only other thing that I would like to point out, why 40,000 megawatt was made as rooftop, because the moment we said 100,000 megawatt, there was severe criticism that there is no land. Cabinet Secretary was taking meeting after meeting to find out whether there is land or not. So one strategic thing that MNRE did, shift 40,000 to rooftop, so nobody will complain that there is land. And we put a footnote in that policy note that later on this can be realigned depending on achievement, which means it can be brought back from rooftop to the solar parks. And I remember those days the cabinet calls a secretary who sends a paper, and the cabinet ministers put questions. So in this case I was called in, and one question was, what is the plan B? Suppose you don't get 100,000 megawatt through solar parks and this thing, what is the plan B? And the plan B, we had told, was the substations in India. You have, some 67 or 68,000 substations. And each substation has some 5 acres of land. If you put 1 megawatt near each substation, well, you are through. Those are the small, informal things which you won't get in official file, because these things all happened, and we are so happy that, it has come along a long way. It has been a lesson for the whole world to think big. Coming back from there, now if I transit to the International Solar Alliance, the issues Sunita pointed out are very critical. Energy, access to lighting. If you look at UN literature today, it talks about, universal energy access by 2030. And ISA feels that 2030 in 21st century is way off. And we should prepone this year to 2025. Because if 1.2 billion people don't have access to electricity, if India could light up 3,000 villages through solar, through REC, the world can do it. And the world has a much bigger economy, $78 trillion dollars. And not only we should prepone that 2030 to 2025, the latest report of the World Bank, it says that by 2040, out of these 1.2 billion people, taking the additions and deletions, still 600 million people will be left without light or access to energy. Now this is very serious matter. If actually we plan 2030, which ISA feels is too late, and now the report coming that 600 million people will still be left without access by 2040, then this is critical. Something has to be done. Now what can be done? If India wants leadership, through ISA, through other things, you must have some financial backup for energy access. Now, what type of financial backup we can talk? I was telling you the India's experience in Reinvest. You ask multilateral banks, please give some commitments that this many $1 million you will invest by 2022 in renewable energy. And what are the response? No, we take any number of projects. We can take up 1 million projects, provided they're bankable. It's very difficult to find a bankable project, to make one, send one, and get it really clear. So we need a bank for energy, we need a bank for sustainable energy. You can call it Global Solar Bank. You can call it ISA Bank. You can call it Global Bank for Sustainable Energy. But this has to have structural differences. Now, one difference in this, it cannot be owned 100% by sovereign countries. It has to be the private sector, the corporate sector has to have a leading role in this, ownership in this. So I feel that this World Sustainable Bank or World Solar Bank that we are talking about, it must say 50% from investment can come from corporate sector, maybe pension funds, and other funds that we talk about, some trillions of dollars are lying. And then this bank, second thing, must have a total focus on sustainability, on accessibility. And then it's personal, the mindsets in that bank will also be ones which understand, sustainability of energy, accessibility to energy, how energy plays an important role in the life of citizens where it matters. Not only that, this bank will have a difference, from other banks in terms of that. All its clients, if you look at the Indian farmers, if some farmer applies for a solar pump, then the bank circulars, except I think one bank last I saw, every bank, I'm subject to change because this story I'm telling 3 years back when I verified how many banks in India actually treat the pump as a collateral. Suppose you buy a car or I buy something, I buy a bus or a truck, these are all collaterals. The bank can give you a loan against the car you buy. But if I'm a farmer and I buy a pump, I cannot treat this as a collateral, which means I have to give separate collateral to get a pump to use for agriculture. Things might have changed in the last 2.5 years or 3 years. But the bank that we are talking about, and if India takes the lead to have a, of course, a country of 1.7 billion people, there is no reason why we can't have a multilateral bank in India. But it is, whether you have it in India or anywhere else in the world, we need one to address these global or universal issues of energy access that we discussed about. So this bank must have some mechanism called risk mitigation mechanism, which is very vital for getting in corporate finance into the energy access sector. Now, what does it mean? It means, suppose, 1 million farmers take loans for solar pumps. If you don't treat the pump as a collateral, then they do not have that much of assets to offer as collateral. So what do? Create a fast loss facility. Put IDA fund or whatever, trust fund that you can put. But you put that if 20% of these farmers fail to pay, that bank must be protected against the money they advance. So this bank is not only different in terms of structure of capital, it is not only different in terms of mindsets it uses, it is not only different in terms of its objective of purely focusing on issues of universal energy access, it not only comes out of the lessons that 600 million people will be left by 2040, it also has set up institutional mechanism to see that its own capital flows into this sector, addressing the issues, but it also helps corporate sector to bring put in money into this area. Well, this is a proposal, and it's not yet official from ISA, although ISA is trying to make a paper to circulate to all the member countries, because the Assembly is the final authority. We propose to take a proposal to the Assembly, and this proposal is being prepared by the Asian Development Bank, a concept note on whether such a World Solar Bank is viable, is it desirable, and is it the most effective way to address the issue that World Bank has found out, that if we do as we do in the business as usual, by 2040, 600 million people will be left still without electricity. If that is a finding which is reliable, then one of the solutions that ISA would offer for the member countries to discuss in the Assembly is to think of a dedicated financial mechanism at global level to address this issue. Not only that, we also talk about 2.4 billion people without access to clean energy fuel, and I fully agree it is so, gender unjust in the sense that world over, most of the gender that engages in cooking are women, and maybe that is one of the reasons why this sector hasn't got that much of priority. I mean, 2.4 billion solar cookers, and these days you have solar cookers which can store heat for 24 hours, and these days you have solar induction cookers, and 2.4 billion solar cookers of this type, which are applicable, which can be done, is a potential source of investment. It's a huge market waiting to be exploited. And when we, of course, talk about the World Solar Bank, we think these are the issues they can take up. These are the market opportunities that can be exploited. And these are the things where you need fiscal mechanisms, financial measures, totally to be dedicated to deal with this issue. A mere declaration that we will sort it out by 2030, by 2040, without a dedicated set of ecosystem to be created in a global scale is not going to work. So this report, in that case, is very timely. It is not only bringing out about one country, the lessons that we have learned and the roadmap that we have to put ahead, it is a trendsetter for the entire world. And we promise from ISA, we will circulate this report to all the countries. And in fact, we are working out which are the 10 innovations that ISA can bring in. The Prime Minister of India the other day told that 2 things should be the guiding principles for ISA. One is one world, one sun, and one grid. And the second is ISA as OPEC of the world. Now, and the second one is very relevant because last week we were in Abu Dhabi, and there was a gentleman from Germany who is actually called the father of renewable energy. He was talking about 100% renewable. He says 100% renewable will come not only because we want it, or not only because market wants it, but because the climate warming issues will make us so nervous. And one example he gave, the hidden methane in the seabed. And beyond a temperature, I'm told, this methane comes out, right? And once it starts coming out, and I'm told it comes in bubbles, and look at, a whole ocean full of bubbles, and they're called methane bubbles, nobody can stop it. And methane is more deadly than carbon. And it is so funny that carbon, which makes life, in fact, sometimes you wonder whether consciousness is a property of carbon, and that same carbon is creating problem. And so if those dangerous things set in, like methane bubbling. And then we have no way. The entire mankind is known to act also with a little bit of nervousness. And suddenly we'll find in international legislation that any production from or fossil sources is temporarily stopped. There may be resistance, but then what do you do in case question of life and death? If you know surely the whole mankind is going to disappear or all cities are going to be submerged, nobody will protest. They'll say, okay, for the time being, let us temporarily do something. And these are the situations where, the principle of, precautionary principle says that we should stand, we should devise, we should think. And the unique thing with us is that we can think, we can plan, we can rationalize. So we can always have a plan B and a plan C. So plan B is the usual course, plan A, and plan B, of course. And where is plan C? That is where I think these reports set a trend for us to think about new things. And in this case, Aisha, for example, we are talking about what are the 10 innovations that we can bring in, apart from implementing 5 programs, apart from putting in the Infopedia, which connects 121 countries, and now the membership has been opened up once the amendment comes into force, or the apart from the star centers in all member countries, the solar applications, technology and research centers, where we can put a framework for R&D, for certification, for quality control, the awareness that we are talking about, the solar revolution that we are talking about. But if we look at this trend of 10 innovations that we are talking about, in each of the solar-related areas, I must tell you 2 small, factual things before I conclude. I have some time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one is the event in Djibouti. When I was invited by the president and I went there, I made a small request. I would like to stay in a village where there is no electricity. And they found a village, some 200 kilometers away from the city, but finally they said, don't stay here, come back after seeing. And but along the way, when we went, after 100 kilometers, we went to the desert and everything was a road. Everywhere all the 4 or 5 vehicles went, that was road because it was very good like roads. We reached that village. It had 360 kilowatt of solar energy. And I tell you, it was so brilliant in that middle of desert to have electricity. And the president had told me that this solar energy is creating problem for us. And he explained to me how this was a problem. And there I understood why it was a problem. Because this village had only 360 kilowatt and the demand was fully met. Now more of nomadic people around who are not used to a village life. They are free. They go there every evening, they decide where to stay. And night they stay, morning they start again. They found this light very attractive. And they are coming to that village. And their number has gone beyond 250 or 300. And they want now this upgradation of this mini grid. And that was in a lighter vein, the Honorable President was saying, it's creating problem, it's creating demand for more money. It is creating a demand that other villages around must have the same facility of a solar mini grid. But in that village, where the water table is 800 feet below, there was something very interesting. You find all the young people, 10 of them, they were doing solar business. And there is no other business in that village. So the solar business means they got these solar batteries, they charge in the sunlight, and they trade. They actually rent it out. And it supports actually 3 bulbs. So you can take out a charger and you pay some little money for each night, and you can use 3 bulbs in your hut or whatever place you are staying. So in a sense, I found that solar light there is creating villages, expanding villages. It's such a new dimension. For me it was very enlightening. And of course, when we were just staying in that village, it is very rare that you find rains. And it did rain heavily. And result, everything was flooded because no water goes inside. In the desert, it forms a plaster of Paris type thing, so everything gets flooded. But an hour or so, again, roads were clear and we came out. That is the one thing. And the other thing was, again, last week, I happened to see 1177 megawatt of solar park in near Abu Dhabi. Now, this park is again unique because, the type of new systems are coming up. You call auctions, you can call generation 1 auctions, generation 2 auctions. generation 3 auctions like 3G, 4G and all that. Some countries like Chile, they're coming back, look, you use any renewable energy 24/7, you give us power from renewable sources. It can be a mix of solar, wind, and in ISA we actually call there are 2 types of solar energy. One is solar proper, and the other is solar derivatives like wind and all that. So a combination is not a bad idea. But this 1177 megawatt in the middle of the desert, it has brought countries together. Like it is a project, it is a company from China, a company from Japan, and the UAE government. Now the equity has been distributed 60-20-20, 60% towards the land. The first loan are repaid, and they don't have trackers because they found that trackers, both day and seasonal tracking, was less effective, and it is about to be completed. But the point was, if you just take the 300 acres of stretch from this unlimited desert, you can get an inkling as to how much actually the deserts can produce. And this gives scope not only for manufacturing in one country, it also gives ideas that some collective mechanism, maybe that global solar bank that we are talking about, can put manufacturing centers in the middle of sub-Saharan areas where there is tremendous market, and tremendous market also for exporting solar. If you are talking about one world, one sun, one grid, and feeding can be from various parts. Half of the globe is always dark, and sun, as you know, is the greatest Marxist. He never discriminates anyone, bad, goods, old, young, developed, underdeveloped. Everybody, he is equally kind. Now, given this setup, and given that wind can actually feed in, can supplement, you can have a system world over, which is possible. But the bottom line, again, to conclude, I fully agree with the conclusion, the seriousness of what we are having now. 1.2 billion people without electricity, 2.4 billion people without access to clean energy fuel. It's not something, in 25th century, when they will have energy, plenty of energy, and they will be seeing there was a century in 21st and 20th century where so many people didn't have access to energy. And that is not a very good reflection on the civilization that we are in. And we do need to think very innovatively how to, not only go on talking about these issues everywhere. We have been, I have been thinking for last 10 years, we have been, everywhere you go, you can always change the time calendar, but the events remain the same. We have to think seriously and act seriously so that these problems are addressed. We cannot say that this is a problem which is intractable, it cannot be solved by us, or it requires a PhD in rocket science to solve it. It's a basic question of putting resources, and they haven't got resources because, as Surita said, most of the people who cook are women. So maybe that is why their voice has not been heard so far, or maybe their income is totally discounted. Yes, very few countries actually add to the GDP, the income that we derive from their hard work. So to conclude, ISA will work in collaboration with CSG. We actually would love to have them as our advisors. And we do need all the countries, and 71 countries have signed the treaty so far, 48 have ratified, and the membership has been opened. But I am sure this ISA is going to be a very dynamic platform which will propose and secure effective mechanisms which will address the issues, so that maybe beyond 2025, we will say there are 0 persons in the world, 0 families in the world who have no access to energy or who have no access to clean energy fuel. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Very good. Helping us to give us that big picture. Thank you. I'm not going to open up this session for question and answers, because the next session post tea is going to be, we're going to dive deep, and then there's going to be question and answers focused on it. I just want to conclude, and I just want to thank both Priyavat, CB, Chandrabhushan, who led this entire work, as well as Mr. Tripathi for coming here, and a little bit of nostalgia also from me. Mr. Tripathi talked about him joining in 2014 and having to face this 100,000. Actually, it's interesting, Mr. Tripathi, because I was a member of the Prime Minister's Council in the prior time, and I'm the one who shot down the 100,000. Okay? In fact, at that time, it was 20,000 megawatt. Because when we started our discussion in the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change on solar energy, we came up with this, it's lovely. It always is very nice to have this massive target. And the question I asked at that time was, how are we going to achieve it? Where is the financial systems to be able to get this off the ground? And then we did a lot of hard work at that stage and came up with the bundling, if you will remember, the NTPC clean, dirty bundling that we came up with. And we came up with a system to make it achievable. So we said, roll down your target, bring it down, but make sure you can achieve your target. And that was something that we did in the first round. Now, it was wonderful that you were there in the second round, because when you can achieve something, it's also good to think big after that. And that was the time to be able to think much bigger and to think much more grander, because it's important to give the world and the country a big vision. And that solar energy is no longer peripheral, or renewable energy is no longer peripheral. It's not a has-been sector, that you do everything, and you've been at MNRE, it was always a scientific ministry. It was always seen as do everything in power and then a little bit of clean on the side, That's good that we've brought it center stage. But honestly, and I think that's where the critical moment today is, and I hope we will take it with that seriousness today. The difference between a laudable but a critical vision versus implementation of that is derived from the purpose that society sees behind the entire way ahead. And I think what we are missing today, and that's what I hope we will spend more time discussing, is both the mechanics of how are you going to make that jump ahead, what would it take, the financial systems, the regulatory systems, the technology systems, but also what is the societal purpose that this clean source of energy must provide. And if we can base our policies on the purpose, then I think we will have a far more sustainable sector for the future. Otherwise, you will get a sector, it will be part of the big boys, but it will not be as big as it can. So I think we will be selling it short if we don't give it the purpose that it deserves. The purpose to meet 100% electricity, the purpose to meet the needs of poor women who don't have cooking fuel, and the purpose to make sure that we can combat climate change and local air pollution. So if we can give it that purpose, we actually give it the driver for the future. And if you give it that driver, you will begin to look for policies which are conducive. I will ask my colleagues to send you, Mr. Tripathi. CSE actually did a lot of work on looking at the global mechanism for getting a global system going in which you could get every household, you could get renewable energy supported and subsidized. But as I said, you will have to repurpose this work. And I hope these 2 days will help us to do so. So thank you once again for coming. There's tea outside, and we will begin the next session with CB in charge. Thank you.